Hi, Jazz. Hi, everybody. We're just having a little warm up now. We will start the official session probably in about 2 or 3 minutes. So, Jazz, as we're in the warm up, is there anything you'd like to say, or at least keep smiling?
I think I'll keep smiling, and as long as it doesn't make me look suspicious, because my girlfriend seems to think I'm suspicious every time I'm smiling.
Oh, okay. Well, we could. That sounds an interesting subject for maybe another one of these.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have, if we can have 3 second silence, just so there's a clean break, and then we'll go into the session. Welcome, Jazz. Welcome, everybody else. I'm delighted to welcome you to this LinkedIn Live on science, consciousness, AI, and coaching, which I think is an absolutely fascinating subject. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating subject because normally I go into quite a lot of detail, which is about getting people from A to B, but this lets us step back and take a wide picture. And I think it's really useful. I think it's really useful to do that. We're going to split this webinar into 3 different sections. The first section is going to be an introduction. So I'm going to say very briefly about myself. Jazz hopefully is going to say a little bit more about himself. We'll then look at the purpose of what we're doing. And then to sort of ground us for the start, we'll both say how we're benefiting from AI at the moment in our practices, the things we're using it for and the things we're not using it for. Then we're going to get into the topic of science, consciousness, AI, and coaching, and talk about what they are, how they interact, how they're going to change into the future. And we're then going to summarize at the end by bringing it again back to practical stuff of, as far as anybody listening, if you want to get into more of this stuff, and I'm sure you're already in a lot of it, but if you want to get into more of this stuff, some very practical ways that you can get into it and maybe do it quicker and with more fun than we have ourselves. So a little bit about me. I'm Michael Beale. I'm a one-to-one NLP trainer, NLP coach. That's influence and communication skills. I'm a Marshall Goldsmith stakeholder and leadership coach, but I also have a fascination for AI for both individuals and for companies. So that's sort of what I'm about, and I host a LinkedIn Live on one of those subjects every month. Now, my claim to fame, if I had a claim to fame, is that during my NLP programs, I have some very interesting people, and Jazz is one of those people, and I'm now going to get him to introduce himself.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
About you.
I will just share a little bit, a brief précis of everything I've been up to in my life. For the last year, I've been very focused on how AI is utilized by coaches in a way that is ethical and that follows compliance more than it is a rush around just getting a badge for AI and getting competence in AI. So I've been working a lot with the governing bodies and various institutions to facilitate that. And the key focus for me has been trying to get a curriculum for coaches to learn how to use AI professionally and in compliance with things like the EU AI Act, for example. I'm part of the Skills and Diversity Council for Tech UK. That's the trade body in the UK for technology businesses and industries. It's an advisory body for the UK government, so we often advise on things like policy and new initiatives, especially around digital literacy, diversity, and essential skills, especially around new ones to do with artificial intelligence. I spend quite a bit of time with industry leaders and ministers from government doing that work. But before all of that, I have been an executive coach for about 20 years. And for the period of 2015 to 2022, I was a research fellow at Ravensbourne University in London, where my focus was doing research into the future and how technologies that are emerging could help in education and the workforce. And I did a big project working with NASA, designing new ways to improve performance of the astronauts that are due to go up to the space station. And I worked at their base in Italy for 2 or 3 years. Before that, I created my own AI coaching platform as far back as 2008. And I've been developing best practices around use of AI in coaching since then. But long before that, I was a scientist and very much interested in researching consciousness. My master's degree was studying drugs that work on consciousness, namely anesthetics. So I really got to understand how consciousness emerges from the brain, and more importantly, how it might eventually be encoded, for example, into things like AI and utilized eventually in things such as coaching. So that's my background. I will be drawing on my first degree a little bit today, which is physics. And you'll find that there will be a central theme running throughout today's presentation, which I will actually draw from, which is one of the laws of physics, if you like, that we really should be utilizing if you want to create some solid principles for coaching to become an actual professional discipline as opposed to just a practice.
Brilliant. And again, back down to earth, because we're going to float up into the stratosphere later on with what we do. Back down to earth, what are some practical ways that you use AI in your actual practice at the moment?
Well, having built my own AI coaching platform that I've been using for about 16 years now, it's got 3 parts to it. The first part is a psychometric. It's a profiling tool which looks at how people are meeting their needs through emotional and social intelligence. And then the AI, the underlying data science, machine learning analytics, looks at all the numbers, reads between them, and then recommends to a coach or a client what priority, which need they should focus on, and what kind of emotional or social intelligence mindset they need to actually work that with. And it's used to not just help them through their coaching, through a process of effectively creating a digital twin of that client and working with them, saying, look, this is what's going on for you. Let's see how we can improve this through insight and through empowerment. It can be used to actually connect people up into teams and manage the team coaching through the use of AI. It involves a lot more complexity and dynamics, but the underlying AI is scalable in how it works. And in addition to helping individual team members, it can actually understand the dynamics between team members and hopefully cultivate work that's useful for the team's purpose and the various things it's got to do in terms of the projects that team actually works with. So that's a practical way in which I use my own tools that I've been doing for 15 years, but public commercial tools are out there. I use ChatGPT a lot because 50% of my time is, if I use AIs, it will be with that. And I specifically use it just ready to join dots. I already have ideas. I just want to see if there's links between them or there's something which might be of value in terms of building a relationship between them. And Perplexity, I use a lot for the fact that it can give references and citations that are genuine and not likely to be hallucinated. And the way that those results are laid out are pretty good in terms of how the sources are cited in the response. In terms of imaging tools, I use, historically I've used Midjourney quite a bit, but more recently I've probably used Napkin.ai. So if you've got an idea and you've written it down and you want it somehow turned into an illustration, you can highlight your whole block of text and you've got an option to pick from lots of different infographics and diagrams that represent the context of what you're actually talking about. And for me, a lot of what I do is better explained in the form of infographics and visuals rather than just talking about it or writing about it. So I'm quite keen on using that tool quite a lot. Other than those key tools, I've occasionally used Anthropic's Claude to get writing to be a bit more professional. And I've also used other tools, analytics within business intelligence tools, for example, Power BI, which is a business intelligence tool. So the analytics side is really important to me. It's not mostly focused on conversational AI, like generative AI. It's really looking at data science, machine learning, and crunching numbers, and then turning those numbers into meaningful descriptions, English descriptions of things that might be useful in helping a client out during a coaching session or helping a group or a team of people Those are the main sort of AIs that I currently work with, in addition to the one I've created myself, of course.
Okay, cool. I'll add my bit to that because I'm sort of coming at it a slightly different direction. The four I use are ChatGPT. I always get the initials wrong. Whatever it is, chat, whatever it is, which tends to be one of choice. I am now using Gemini far more than I was. I found that it gives me nice descriptions of search engine type stuff, and it sort of understands Google quite well, or it seems to. But it does it in a gentle way.
Have you used Notebook at all? Because I did a webinar this morning with the EMCC. Now you can use Notebook LM to gather all your research documents and then ultimately put together a research paper or a publication of some kind. And having a tool like that, which gathers together your assets and resources and be able to organize them and even quiz them like an AI would, I think that's really, really been helpful lately. So that's underpinned by Google's Gemini.
Interesting, because research, which I was going to say, is one of the things I use this for. But the other two, which are more specialist that I really love, are sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Digital Ray, which is Ray Dalio, and he's very good at principles, and he built the largest hedge fund in the world. And I quite like the idea of principles fitting into my coaching as to, if we can define some principles, it becomes a navigation point. And also Marshall Goldsmith, and I say you can argue Marshall is one of the very top, or used to, when he was actively coaching, one of the very top business coaches in the world, having coached, I think, 200 of the very top CEOs. He has some very good processes. So I look at his stuff for process, and I know, Jazz, we were talking earlier about some process you had, and it tied in very nicely with one of Marshall's. What do I use it for? Research, but probably not in the sort of posh way that you're doing it. Very simple stuff like, what are people's challenges? What are people's opportunities? What are their issues? There is something about content that I'm finding it fascinating, and again, it's sort of input to give me extra ideas, but I've had one or two delightfully difficult conversations lately, and I found, and I can't remember which one I used actually, but I found it really good in focusing what I said, so I got the message over without messing it up, but also being respectful for myself and the other person, and doing it in as fewer words as possible.
I think conciseness, and I think getting the spirit of something.
It's getting both the tone, but the language is very direct.
Something I discovered recently was Auto Expert, I think it is.
Yeah.
If you go to ChatGPT, it's one of the custom GPTs on there, and it's a bit like Notebook LM in the sense that you can upload a document or a paper, and it will basically do a critical review of it for you, and it'll identify what its value might be, for example. So that's something which anybody who's doing research into consciousness, or especially it's linked to AI and coaching, for example, that's something that's a really useful tool, because if there's some papers that you're looking at and you don't want to read the whole 20, 30 pages in the paper, but you want to get the spirit of it, Auto Expert's pretty good at that. And then if you like the one-page summary it does of it, then obviously you can go and delve a bit deeper into the full paper itself. Oh, I know it's the word delve, and I promise you I'm not an AI. I know that's commonly words used, words by AIs.
I use it a lot directly with my clients, and this is very open stuff. I'll actually get them to use it to help themselves, because I want to nudge my clients on into using this stuff better, because I think it's it's really important. But it was in Marshall Goldsmith coaching, this is a thing called feed forward, where you ask for ideas of how you can get better in the future. Mm-hmm. And I specifically ask all the AIs, I want to get better at this, or my client wants to get better at this, come up with 2 ideas that he could do, and I pull the ideas, and I say I'm doing it with my client. I'm not doing it behind the scenes with my clients. I actually get my clients to contribute to the process. And although I have to be careful saying it, sometimes the AI gives much better answers than humans. There are other alternatives which we will talk about later. So the last point I want to make is I'm using it with my clients. I'm not using it to my clients. I'm sharing. We are because to me, like humans, the quality of the answer depends on the quality of the question, and therefore you work with your clients to work out what are the best questions to ask. So that's what I'm using it for. And as I say, I am surprised and delighted the way that it seems to be getting a lot better quicker. Okay, but that's that will come on to later. So that's how we're using it. Let's get on to the sort of main meat of what we're talking about, which is science, science, consciousness, AI, and coaching. Now, Jazz, you came up with this title, which I have to say I really loved, but I'm quite curious because I've reflected since we started this. What are all these things about? Because it's as though I've gone to a whole new level of consciousness even in thinking about them. So why did you choose science, consciousness, AI, and coaching?
Because they have a common theme that runs between them. One of the reasons I did that was because over the last year, as I've been trying to look at new forms of standards to use AI in coaching, the issue of exactly what is coaching, a definition for it, came up, and exactly what is it when we're using AI in coaching. And definitions were going to be a big challenge for me in the last year to ensure that people got clarity on what was actually being talked about. So when it came to AI and coaching and also consciousness and science, I realized that one of the things that was really important is for anything to become a science, it really needs clear definitions. It needs an evidence-based approach to things, a proof-based approach to things. And when I look at background of my science in terms of physics and molecular biology, a lot of definitions are usually provided for in ways that link to things like laws of physics. And a long time ago, when I was studying physics, I studied thermodynamics, and one of the most, if you like, the law, which all other laws in the universe answer to, it's the granddaddy of them all, is the law of conservation of energy. And in simplicity, it says that you can't create energy or destroy it. All you can do is transform it from one kind to another. So if you look at anything, a human body, a car or aeroplane, all the energy that it has is just there, and there's no more and there's no less. You can't take any of that energy and destroy it or suddenly create something out of nowhere. All you can do is change it from one kind to another. You can turn petrol energy into mechanical energy in a car. You can turn food energy into warmth for you and brain operations if you want to. But overall, the entire quantity of energy doesn't change. The qualities change from one kind to another, but the quantity doesn't. The reason why that's so important is because when it comes to consciousness, our brain especially, and the consciousness that most people associate with that, our brain actually is built on principles to do with conservation of energy. If it didn't, the energy it got from food and other resources would rapidly diminish. So the brain is highly optimized, not just in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of effectiveness. It's really good at respecting the law of conservation of energy and making sure energy isn't wasted, and that every little bit is not just maximally used, but also effectively recycled and redistributed as well. And these are important qualities when it comes to conservation of energy, because when it comes to things like AI, everything in AI, in order for it to give you a response in a decent amount of time, it really has to exercise conservation in the algorithms it uses, how much data it draws on, and things like that. Now, in terms of actual physical energy, unfortunately, a lot of AIs are terrible because they consume vast amounts of energy and generate a huge amount of carbon footprint in terms of what they do. So from a conservation of energy perspective, most models that you see out there right now, they're just absolutely terrible in that respect. But they're hoping to get these AIs more and more advanced and powerful by optimizing their algorithms and being more selective about the data that they actually use. So that bit is very conservational. Now, when it comes to coaching, when I've worked with clients, and this is something that relates to what you said earlier about Marshall, a long time ago, someone said, "What's your idea of coaching?" And I said, well, a lot of clients that come to see me, they really need help in one or more of three ways. They either need help to do more of something, they need help to do less of something, or they just need help to not interfere with something that's actually working. And the problems typically arise when they end up doing the opposite. For example, they needed to do less of something, but they did more, like eating, for example, and maybe they need to do more exercise, but they end up doing less. And the worst thing is when they actually interfere with something they really should have left alone. And I think a lot of people have got experience of what the costs are of interfering with something that you really should have left alone and not interfered with, right? So a lot of coaching is about just knowing that there are things that you need to do more of, less of, and you also need to not interfere with. But the hard part in coaching comes in identifying what those things are. What is it you should do more of? What is it you should do less of?
No, I buy it. And as I said, because it's something I do with my clients, so I'm gonna mention it. There's the Marshall thing is really, what should you start or do more of? What should you do less of? And there's one more that I throw in, which is what should you start doing that you've always put off doing? And sorry, there's one more that's gone, but I agree. It follows that pattern very well. And these things are easy to talk about, but less easy to do. But I rather like this point of conversation of energy, because I think that's one of the reasons that coaching is more of a challenge than people think, because people know what they do, but because we consciously know what to do doesn't mean the body provides the energy to do it.
It's funny, I misheard what you just said. Maybe you did say, I don't know. I thought you said, instead of conservation of energy, I thought you said conversation of energy. And actually, I thought, that's quite important to do. A lot of this is actually about trying to have a conversation, having an exchange with energy. And it can be through actual conversation. It could be through actions. It could be through processes. But often these energetic conversations, they shape our relationships with ourselves and our perceptions between our thoughts, and also our relationships with other people. So the things that we do with our energy, they actually shape our relationships. In fact, I gave a definition a long time ago for a working definition of energy, because there's so many different ways that energy can be thought of. And I specifically wanted to make it a kind of universal definition that would work for physicists as well, much as it would work for therapists and coaches. And the definition I came up with, the short version, was that energy is the quantity and quality of relationship within a system and between that system and others. So it could be a person, a person's energy could be about the quantity and quality of the relationship they have with themselves, or the relationship they have between themselves and others. Now, when you change those relationships internally and in between people, the person's energy actually changes physically. And the reverse is true as well. You could say that relationships are really the quantity and quality of energy within a system and between that system and others. And if you change the energy within people and between them, their relationships are going to change. They're going to transform. So that mutual reciprocal bond, if you like, between energy and relationship, I think is critical to understanding consciousness. It's critical to knowing how to model intelligence and consciousness into AI. And lastly, it's really an important thing ultimately that you're going to be managing in actual coaching sessions, because ultimately what you're managing is the interventional relationship, the relationship you have with the client. And when you manage that properly, you change the energy within you as a coach, but also change the energy within the client. And when that transformation of energy occurs, if it's done in a way which conservation of energy was practiced, the person should come to life a little bit more. They should get a bit more clarity and more vitality in their demeanor and be a bit more alive, literally. And if that's not happening, then you probably didn't exercise conservation of energy very well. So there's something really important to bear in mind, that relationship between that kind of connection between energy and relationship.
Okay, can I bring you back? There's like a quick fire questions, if we can do it that way. What's your definition of science?
Well, if I look at the standard definition of science, which is it's very much about knowledge, and it's very much about proof. behind that knowledge. When I looked at the Latin roots of the word science,
Yeah.
Some of you may know that the SCI bit at the beginning, it is something that is the beginning of a lot of words. Often they're to do with words that are to do with cutting, like, an incisor or scissors
Yeah.
or something like that, right? And the iant bit at the end is to do with knowledge. It's to do with awareness or intelligence. So when you're looking at science, what you're really looking at is something that cuts up knowledge. It cuts up experience, and by cutting it up, it's possible to see what it's made of. Now, that's not the exact etymological definition of what science is, but when I first came across and looked at science as something that enables me to get knowledge of the world in pieces that can be joined up and be used to make sense of things, that's how I always started to look at science. That's for me how it worked for me.
Okay, and you mentioned the word proof, or something came up, because that's the other bit that I think is interesting.
Yeah, but often when people talk about science or research, the word they're more likely to use is that it's evidence-based.
Yes.
But evidence is one kind of proof. Probably a better word to use is empirical, as opposed to evidence-based, because empirical includes proof, which is not just hard and measurable through numbers and instruments and things like that. It's not just visible and tangible. That a lot of that is very evidence-based, and also mathematics behind that too. The other two kinds of proof that are really critical, I think, are experience. Some people have an experience of something, and even though there's no physical evidence of it, for them it's real. For them it's proof that something is real. So a person's experience can be considered proof, at least to that person, if not anybody else. And the third kind of proof, which is really important, is actually to do with education. So the three kinds of proof are evidence, experience, and education.
How is education proof?
Well, education, many of you may be familiar with the idea of a mathematical proof, for example.
Right.
There's a formula, there's an idea, there's a concept, and it holds water, and it's been tested in terms of logic or in terms of maths or things like that. And it's considered as a proof. Like an example is Einstein's theory of relativity. When he came up with it, there was no proof for it, in the world in terms of evidence, let alone experience. And it took a solar eclipse to demonstrate that light bent around the sun courtesy of gravity, which is one of the things that was predicted from his theory mathematically. So the mathematical proof was absolutely solid, despite the fact that there wasn't any physical evidence or experience of it. And then one day people gathered the evidence to show there was alignment to that mathematical proof. So if there's a competency or a knowledge base or an underlying philosophy that holds water, it can be tested. It can be checked to see if it works or it doesn't intuitively or logically. So these three kinds of proof, evidence, experience, and education, are critical. And if you can find something which allows you to get all three kinds of proof for something, that is the most valid kind of empirical persuasion that you can give people. Some people are quite happy with the evidence, even though there's no experience or model for it. Other people are very happy just with the experience, even if there's no evidence. And others are just happy with a little proof or a model, even if there's no experience or evidence. But you can always sell something to somebody if you provide all three kinds of proof. There's evidence, and experience.
Let's move on from that. And I'm fascinated by what you're saying here. Consciousness. What is your definition of consciousness?
Well, it's something that links to our relationship with ourselves and the world, and through our experience. And in a simplest way it can be described is it's the sum effect of all the relationships that we've ever had and dynamics that we've experienced in our life. So relationship here could mean relationship with what you've seen through your eyes or what you've heard in terms of your environment. Relationship could mean to do with your self-esteem and identity. Relationship could mean how you've connected with your mother and your father or your brothers, how you've connected with nature and the world, for example. So if you add up the effects of all those relationships and the imprinting that's been done on your brain, the net effect of all of that is your current consciousness.
Okay, let's move on from that. Actually, no, a question first. We've talked about science and consciousness. What's the relationship between science and consciousness?
It's a good point, because there are many evidence-focused scientists out there who will tell you that your consciousness, your awareness, is what's called epiphenomenon. It means it's something that is a consequence of all the electronic firings of your brain cells. It's the collective net effect of those. And your consciousness can be switched off, because you can. And this is what my master's degree studied. We studied general anesthetics and looked at where in the brain those anesthetics act on, and there are technically switches that can be switched off, and in a neuron in a particular brain cell. And when the anesthetic does this, it essentially switches off the electrical currents running around inside the brain cell. And if you switch off the electrical currents, not just within the brain cell, but also between the brain cells, then that's when a person loses consciousness and they go into general anesthesia, like you would, if someone's going to surgery, for example. Now, that's the reductionist, Western, materialistic, scientific kind of understanding of consciousness. It's all about brain cells and electrical currents running around them and between them. And if you switch those electrical currents off using something like an anesthetic, then there's no more consciousness. And it proves the point. But that's a Western materialistic reductionist perspective. People from the East, especially from places like India, China, and other countries like Africa and Pacific nations, they have a different perspective of consciousness, which is linked to nature. And it's not to do with the firings of brain cells. It's more, again, it's more to do with the relationship. It's more to do with dimensions as well. The dimensions that we live in and work in and experience in the three-dimensional world that we're in, that moves through time, that's a very limited perspective that we have of the world. In certain states of consciousness, it's possible to elevate your awareness and see the world beyond physical senses, to see the world, for example, across time and not just across space. So those perspectives of consciousness, they're more what might be called unitary. They recognize that your consciousness is not just in your brain, but it's found in an interconnected way with everything else in the universe. And there's some aspects of quantum physics, the most kind of advanced science there is in the world, that suggests there is this interconnection between all things. And that interconnection isn't just some passive thing. It's got a kind of sentience to it. It's got a kind of intelligence to it. So that's another way of looking at consciousness. It's not something just in the brain, but as an interconnected kind of field of energy.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now let's move on to AI. Give me a tight definition of AI, but I'm also interested in the relationship between science, as you were talking about, and consciousness and AI.
Well, if you look at a 10-year-old's definition of AI, you could say it's, like teaching a computer to think and make decisions like a human being. That's basically what it is. But some of the more sophisticated definitions of what AI are, for example, from the EU and other international kind of bodies and organizations that work with what AI actually is, they say that an AI's system, and it's a machine, it's an actual machine-based system, and what it can do is it can infer things from the inputs it receives, and it generates outputs.
So just talk about that a little bit more, because I say it can infer things from the inputs that it receives, so it can predict the future from the past.
No, it might not be anything to do with the past. It might be just a group of facts, for example, or some data, and it can join dots between them, and it can make a guess as to how they might be related and generate some outputs. And from that, it could make predictions, it could generate content, recommendations, and it can even influence physical or virtual environments. So the main thing about that definition is you have stuff being put in. There's some processing that goes on to guess what it might mean, and then an output is created in a framed way that's aligned to what the person is looking for, who's actually working with the AI. It's linked to the prompt or the input that person actually gave. Now that's nothing to do with coaching per se, but there are people who've given basic perspectives on what AI is in coaching, especially chatbot delivered coaching, for example. So Jonathan Passmore and Sandra Diller, they gave a very short definition of this, and they said that it's synchronous or asynchronous coaching, where the computer is used as a coach instead of a human coach. So synchronous and asynchronous means it's done in a live way, a stop and start kind of way. So that's a kind of not what you might call working definition. It just gives you an idea of what it might actually be. But that's, like I said, a long way from a working definition.
No, okay. Moving forward, then, what is I want to add to what you say on this, but what is your view on coaching? What's your definition? What's a useful definition of coaching as far as you're concerned?
Well, the definition I created for what AI coaching is remarkably similar to what most people would consider a definition of coaching. So what might be good if I just share with you what I think AI-based coaching actually is. And you'll probably notice there are a lot of things in there that relate directly to what most people's experience of coaching is, regardless of whether it's done with AI or whether it's done with human beings. So for me, the first thing that's really important is that it's something that is based on an interventional relationship. Now, what do I mean by interventional relationship? It means a person is working with another person to address something, to carry out an intervention to help that individual. So that intervention that's being helped with in a client, for example, is being helped through a relationship between the coach and the client. So the interventional relationship is critical. And that intervention could be a coaching kind of intervention. It could be a mentoring or a therapy intervention. But just using the words interventional relationship universalizes it, if you like, in terms of a helping relationship. But the most important thing about that is psychological safety. In order for anything to happen with regards to an intervention, it's really important to have psychological safety first. And with regards to AI, it's really important that the AI can facilitate psychological safety being embedded into the relationship between the coach and the client. So its outcome typically is that if you have psychological safety, then you should be in a position then, if the person feels not just comfortable enough, but also psychologically brave as well, that you can start exploring some themes which will generate insights, new perspectives for them. And that's an absolute
that's fine. Can I just hold you there, because you said something that I find absolutely fascinating. So what I'm getting from you is that in coaching there are two key fundamentals. One is that you're in a position where you feel psychologically safe, but also the person being coached has some courage. You use a different word, but has some brave.
The psychological safety facilitates psychological bravery.
Yes, psychological. Yes, yeah. Which I'm curious about, because would you say these are important in all change work and coaching?
Absolutely. Without psychological safety, anything you do following that, if that's not present, then you're probably going to end up doing things that might be overly confrontational and maybe even unethical and cause harm and trigger trauma, for example. So that's the reason why psychological safety is so important. But for the benefits of development and transformation, just feeling safe isn't enough. The client needs to feel brave enough to share something that previously they might have had an inertia to share.
No. I find it fascinating, because it ties in with the research I've looked at as to what makes coaching and all other interventions work. And these things seem to have an absolute key.
So with AI coaching, it's very similar in the sense that AI has to at least provide a quarantined environment where there's safety for the individual, but there's also enough encouragement for them to have the courage, as you say, to actually come up with some kind of reflection or engage with something within themselves. Now, it is a simulation. It's an interactive simulation of what a human coach would do. And it's really important to recognize that it's a simulation. It's not what you call an emulation, where it's an exact copy of what a human coach would do. It's, like I said, it's a facsimile. It's just an approximation to what a human coach might actually do. So all of this has to happen in a way that, and the way that you typically will know that the psychological safety and bravery are in place is if an empathy kind of appears between the client and the coach. So any kind of intervention has to be one that empathically empowers the client to realize their goals and potential. If that empathy isn't there because of a lack of psychological safety or a lack of psychological bravery, then you're going to find that what you're doing in terms of law of conservation of energy, it's not sustainable. Soon enough, the person will shut down, or they'll start talking about something else, and they won't feel brave enough to carry on working on what really actually needed transformation. So that empathy is really, really important. And if it can't do it, in case of an AI, it's got to at least do basic rapport stuff to do with acknowledgement, sympathy, those kind of things. And all of this has to be tracked if it's an AI in terms of analytics, monitoring the conversations, make sure boundaries aren't being crossed, all those kind of things. So that's kind of comparison, if you like, between artificial and...
Okay, that's good. I'm now going to throw a different question, because what I want to do is to move on in a moment to what you see the future of these four things are. Okay.
Yeah.
But as to the present, at this moment in time, what are the strengths of humans in coaching, and what are the strengths of AI in coaching?
I did a big chart recently called the spectrums of AI/human service, because I wanted to look at how far can AI do things compared to human beings, but also what should AI be allowed to do, and also what shouldn't it be allowed to do, even if it can do it.
Yes.
And I summarized it by talking about 4 or 5 different levels of transformation or change. Yeah. And the simplest kind of change someone can go through is where you help them in the moment in a transactional kind of way, and help them shift their perspective in the moment, or maybe relate to something differently. Now, if that's done over a series of activities, that you might actually help them through some kind of transition, a series of transactional kinds of change, if you like. Okay. If it's something that involves more scale and scope, especially if you're working in teams, for example, or an organizational level, then that person may, together with others, take part in a transformation. All these things, transactional, transitional, and transformational kinds of change, they focus on helping people change what they do and how they do it. And AIs are really good at helping people with that stuff. That's like lower common denominators of change, transaction, transitional, and transformational. But the higher stuff, which involves a person's lived experience, their identity, their consciousness, and those kind of things, that's the transcendental forms of change, where you're focusing on helping a person change who they are, as opposed to what they're doing and how they're doing things. So AIs are very good at the lower common denominator stuff to do with what and how. But when it comes to changing who people are, you probably want to leave that to human beings. You don't want to be mucking around with people's identity and triggering trauma in them and all sorts of things like that.
No, okay. So that's thank you for that. What I want to do now is, because you are a futurist in your own way, let's take all those things and not too much detail, but how is science going to change in the future, and is there any relevance between consciousness, AI, and coaching in that? So first of all, how is science going to change, do you think?
Well, if you look back over history, over the different changes that we've seen in industry and business over the last couple of 100 years, the big milestones have been marked by what people call industrial revolutions. And the current industrial revolution that we're in is Industry 5.0, which is the 5th industrial revolution. It kind of began around 2020, and all these industrial revolutions are driven by shifts in science or in society.
Right.
Okay. So the shifts in science that have happened recently, of course, the biggest ones are to do with AI. And the big concern that's emerged out of the pandemic from 2020 is the increasing use and advance of technologies, but the declining kind of increasing atrophy of human consciousness, well-being, mental coherence, mental integrity, these kind of things. So there's a big call from the EU and other organizations saying, look, it's all very well having these scientific advances, advancing technology and automation and things like that. But unfortunately, there are two things that are happening. Human beings are being left behind, and the ones that are using the technologies, they're using it more for convenience. And as a consequence, their own competence, their own critical thinking is being undermined and atrophying. The machines are getting smarter and smarter, and the humans are getting dumber and dumber. So Industry 5.0 is all about recognizing, no, let's make sure that we use the technology to advance the humanity with the human beings and their capabilities and their critical thinking. Now, if we do that, and that's cyclically fed back into the technologies, we're going to see a future where humans advance in their humanity alongside of the advances in technologies like AI. And if it's a virtuous thing, we're going to see humanity as a whole actually advance. But that's going to have to be integrated into workplaces. So the way things like AI are adapted to first, then integrated, and then fully adopted will determine how effectively workplaces and workforces are not just productive and perform well and generate profit, but actually advance employees and actually elevate their consciousness and ultimately improve humanity as a whole. So that's what Industry 5.0 is very much geared around. So a lot of the work I'm doing is centered around that at the moment.
Okay. Let's move on. Consciousness. How is human, whatever this means, how is human consciousness evolving? And does science AI coaching affect consciousness? And will it have a role to play in the evolution of consciousness?
Right now, there's 2 or 3 kinds of ways in which technologies are enhancing human consciousness. At the base level, they are enhancing the amount of information available for people to generate knowledge from and intelligence. But they're not necessarily generating wisdom from that intelligence. It seems as if that really needs to come from the other direction. A person needs to have a shift in their consciousness first in order to get wise about knowledge and intelligence. So there's no guarantee that any amount of information will ever become a bit of knowledge, and there's no guarantee any amount of knowledge will ever become a bit of intelligence. And similarly speaking, there's no guarantee any amount of intelligence will ever become wisdom. But the other way around, it works. You can use a very small piece of wisdom to generate an awful lot of intelligence, an awful lot of knowledge and awareness. So in terms of advancing consciousness, the thing that I've been pushing people to recognize, especially within the UK government, is not to take a human-centric approach to things, because there's a lot of humans that are bad actors. You don't necessarily want to center things on their behaviors and them, but focus on something a bit deeper and focus actually on a person's humanity and that collective shared humanity that we all have. So take not a human-centric approach, but to take a humanity first, or a humanity-centric approach. If we can use technology to cultivate our humanity within ourselves and between ourselves, we will end up as a more advanced species. But if our own humanity declines in the process of us adopting these technologies, the future's not going to be pretty. People are going to see increased mental,
that sounded an understatement.
That's going to be a consequence.
Let's move on. What are your predictions for where in your view in its evolution is AI now? Where do you think it's going to be over whatever timescale you choose?
Well, there's something I did a presentation on recently, looking at what's going to happen over the next 30 years. And being futurist, it doesn't mean I'm just making guesses. I'm looking at actual real world development and going, how long will that take to mature, for example? And using classical computers, architectures right now that we have, just producing more powerful computers that run faster isn't going to be enough to move from what's called artificial intelligence to what might be called artificial sentience. Now, people like Sam Altman and others, they're all just talking about intelligence. They're talking about artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and super intelligence, but nobody's talking about sentience.
Sorry, can you define sentience?
Sentience is a state of consciousness where you can actually at least have feelings, at least where you can have a emotion, for example. And the higher level above that of sentience is something that our species is actually named after. Homo sapiens are a species that have sapience. And sapience is a very high level of wisdom, creativity, critical thinking, and so on. Now, that's intimately linked in with compassion and consciousness. Now, in order to get to that level, we need to have machines that operate with the same kind of mechanisms, at least that our brain cells do, at least at subatomic, molecular, quantum, neurotransmitter kind of levels. Now, quantum computers do have that capability, but they're in their infancy at the moment. They're the equivalent of a few hundred brain cells, if you like.
Yeah.
You know. But when you start joining these quantum computers up and miniaturizing them, in the near future, probably in the next 5 to 10 years, you will have machines that are beginning to demonstrate artifacts, if you like, of sentience, or being sentient. Just like a dog or a cat or a dolphin is sentient, intelligence is another layer above that, but those things will be possible. Now, in terms of sapience and actual consciousness, machines that have compassion, for example, and wisdom, that'll come from networked quantum machines, and we're looking at maybe 2050 for that. So sentience maybe in the next 5 or 10 years, by 2035, and for machines that are actually conscious and wise and able to even help you transcend who you are, we're looking at about 2050 for that.
Okay, cool. Last question. I'd like you to keep it brief because there's some other stuff I want to talk about, which is practical advice for people or ideas for people to make sense of what we're saying, if that's possible. Cool. What is the future of? What do you see as the future of coaching? Not too much detail, but what do you see? What are the paths on the future?
I know when coaching's really worked well because it's helped a client to coach themselves.
Yeah, right. I like that.
If they've achieved self-coaching mastery, the coaching's done its job,
right?
You know, and the coach isn't needed anymore. It's a similar thing with AI. If an AI could facilitate a client to coach themselves, that's the best thing to do. And the possibility of getting to a point in the future where all coaching genuinely is aimed at facilitating self-coaching within clients, we're not there yet. And the reason why is because most of coaching is very much based on Western psychological models. It doesn't integrate models from other cultures, like those that underpin the practices of mindfulness in Buddhism, for example, or from Africa and from China. Now, when we start integrating models of coaching that have actually been around for thousands of years in those wisdom traditions, then maybe we're going to get to a point where the wise man or the elder isn't always needed to perform the job of coaching somebody. They actually help through the process of a village mentality to help an individual to stand up on their own 2 feet. Psychologically, in terms of their skills and in terms of their emotional and social intelligence. So for me, the future is very much about that. If we can converge coaching into something that results in clients being able to self-coach, then that's the future I'd love to see. And I can't see it happening just using Western psychological models. I actually can't see it happening necessarily just using human coaching. I think if you take a hybrid approach between East and West, and also between humans and machines, then it'll happen.
I like it. Okay, so that's thank you for that. Now I want to bring us back down to earth, if that's the right phraseology, because one of the reasons I like this subject is it lets us float in all sorts of interesting stratospheres. You've got, and I know I'm taking my market here. You've got a young professional setting out. You've got a senior guy in a large company sorting out the politics and the changes in a really complex system, and you've got the entrepreneur that's starting a company or scaling it. Okay, what are some practical ways they can make sense, if that's the right word, of this AI stuff, and what's a way they can get on the get on the bandwagon and start genuinely using it for useful things?
Well, it depends what their focus is. If they're just focused on generating content and getting competent, then they need to take one approach. But if they want to focus first on just making all the safeguards are in place and compliance in place, that requires a different approach. But what I've usually recommended to people is say that at least privately, just experiment with AI and just don't worry about compliance or anything like that, because in your own private time, you can do what you want, essentially. After a while, though, you may realize this is something you want to share or do together with other people,
Yeah.
in which case you're going to need a few bits of ethics in there and some safeguards and also a little bit of compliance. If you want to do this professionally, you actually need to have all of these things on record and enshrined in your practice and your contracting and so on. And for an enterprise organization, you might do all these things in parallel. You might have a team that's experimenting, a team that's looking at how to take what's been experimented with and turn it into something practical, a product or a service. And then finally, a team that packages it all and puts it out there to customers and works with them. So those three kinds of approaches for a single person, a single practitioner, you might want to go through those in that sequence. But if you're an organization, you should be able to set up different teams for each of those, get them to work with each other in that order.
Okay. You've talked about ethics and things like that, and that comes out a lot in this. Who in an organization is responsible for that this stuff is used to help people, not to kill them off? Wrong words, but I want to be quite strong for a point.
Well, historically, when any new technology is brought into an organization, it needs to get approval initially from the people who are responsible for the IT infrastructure. But in order for it to be signed off and connected into the existing systems, in order for there to be integration into the existing systems, that typically needs sign off from the board. But in terms of ethics, the ethics needs to come from the top. You can't rely on ethics ever coming up from the bottom, okay? Because people at the bottom will typically work with lower common denominators of their desires, their priorities, and their preferences. So you need to always work with the higher common denominators of activities. And that typically means that the ethics, the compliance, the quarantining of things, as well as the extraction of innovation and benefit and opportunities, that's got to be defined from the top down.
Okay, now can I just play with that? Does that mean, which happens to be a belief of mine, but I'm very happy you challenge it, that the people at the top have to throw themselves into this stuff?
They need
they can't avoid it. They sort of, as it's for them to deal, I'm just here.
Yeah, it's if there's technology ecosystems that drive their business, who's at the steering wheel? It's got to be them. You know, they don't need to understand what's going on in the engine of a car that they might be driving, but they need to at least know where the brakes are and where the accelerator is and how to handle the steering so they can get from one place to another, you know. So they need to know a little bit about navigation, for example. They can leave what's going on under the engine to the engineers. But if something happens and there's smoke coming out the bonnet, then the engineer and you have to have a conversation, because maybe it's the way you've been driving. You've literally
I get it. So what and you seem to be saying something that I absolutely agree with. Whatever level you're at, you've got to throw yourself in and get your feet wet.
You've got to be able to learn how to steer, and you've got to learn how to slow down and brake, and also know when to speed up and accelerate. The phrase I've loved hearing in the last year more than anything else is, you can drive faster with brakes. You know, and I think it's the same thing with AI. You can innovate, you can take advantage of benefits and opportunities faster if you've got brakes that are typically ethics and compliance factors in place. It just ensures that if you do go faster, you're not going to crash, because if you need to make a turn at any point and you need to slow down and you haven't got brakes, you're going to go off road and you're going to crash, and you want to avoid that.
Okay, two more questions, and I'm going to ask you just to summarize what you think is most important stuff on there. But the two interesting questions is this stuff going to go away? So the first question is this stuff going to go away, or have we reached a point of no return?
I don't think it's going to go away. What people need to recognize is AI is a very loud voice, but it's not the only voice. And when you actually recognize that, and you learn how AI is to be integrated with the other technology ecosystems as well as people ecosystems, then you realize in the future that the focus or the amount of attention that's being paid to this is probably going to go down, because people will begin to realize there are other things that are important to consider, and not just this little loud voice that happens to be shouting right now.
And actually, you brought me on to the second point, which I forgot for a second, but you reminded me of it. There is a lot of crap and noise out there of delightful number of people who don't seem to have a clue what they're talking about, and yet there are those, and this sums up life, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got people that do know what they're talking about, and the stuff is important and is growing. What's your view of how you suggest people can tell the difference?
Learn specifically to tell the difference between hype and hope.
Love it. Yep.
Because there's the phrase I've used to describe how I work with AI and technologies. I've said to people, I'm a champion of AI, but I'm also a skeptic. I'm also a cynic. And I'm also a bit of a conspiracy theorist, because I'm conscious there are people out there in organizations, tech companies, that have got very specific agendas, often now, especially in the States, linked into governmental, players as well.
Yeah.
So when these things all start getting contaminated in terms of how they're being worked with, then you really have to take everything with a pinch of salt. And I would recommend everybody to both be a champion, be a cynic, be a skeptic, and be a conspiracy theorist when it comes to AI, because it's the only way you can avoid being bamboozled and being hoodwinked by it all.
No, okay, that's fine. I want to draw the thing to a close. We've gone slightly over time. Two things. What's the last thought? What's one or two thoughts you'd like to leave people with? Question one. Question two, how can they contact you, etc., etc.? Just give us a little bit of a plug of which sort of people would you like to contact you, and how do they do it? So firstly, last couple of thoughts.
My last couple of thoughts are centered on what I've repeatedly said throughout today, which is linked into consciousness in a lived way. And that is how we cultivate and develop and work with our personal humanity we have within ourselves, together with other people. The approach for the future, especially with Industry 5.0 approaches, is the first industrial revolution, which focuses on human development and advancement. So the thing that's the most precious and deepest within human beings is their humanity. So if we can do everything we can as much as possible with a humanity first kind of mindset, I think we'll make the best of ourselves and with each other.
Brilliant. And how can people contact? I'll put some notes out, but how can people contact you?
The best way to keep track of what I'm doing is just check my posts on LinkedIn. And also, if you look at the AI Coaching Alliance LinkedIn group, you'll see a lot of posts I will share there. And that LinkedIn group's got over 460 members who are coaches and researchers into AI and how it can be used in coaching. So if you want to keep your finger on the pulse with regards to those kind of things, just join the AI Coaching Alliance group, and you'll get updates of everything I'm actually doing or thinking about, or events that I'm actually doing as well.
Absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to add that, because I think, fun enough, we sort of start with coaching and this sort of stuff, and it goes back to my original NLP roots. It's becoming more important that we lead ourselves through this, because I think we are going to go through a period of chaos. There are going to, just like the hero's journey, there are going to be people that are seducers that try to waylay us, and there are people that are going to be advisors. But we have to be able to choose which we go with, and the advisors are sometimes more boring than the seducers. So I think we're in a fascinating. I think it's a fascinating, slightly scary, hugely exciting world. Jazz, I really appreciate your input today, and thank you very much.
It's an honor to have been invited to be provoked by you.
And thank you very much. Everybody, thank you very much for listening. In about a month, we've got another one on AI, and we're looking at AI and strategy with a guy that's allegedly worked with Bill Gates and Satya at Microsoft. But that's another story for the future. I really like the way we sort of move to that more humanity bit, because it's very easy to miss it out, and we cease to become humans if you miss it out. Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody.
Take care.